these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
All right, so Thanksgiving dinner is coming up, and you've decided you're going to have a political debate right in the middle of dinner, and that's going to go really well. Look, first things first, try to avoid political debates during family Thanksgiving. But if you can't, I have recorded this podcast so that you might have some tips and some tricks and some facts in your back pocket for some of the most debatable issues of our time, because there is always that liberal cousin that just can't help themselves and they just want to talk to you about politics and how mean Trump is and blah, 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 blah. So, God, we could do this for hours. I've chosen a few key topics, and first I'm going to start off with some general advice here. Okay, some kind of a step-by-step process of how you should think about discussions at the family dinner. Again, number one, don't have political debates at the family dinner. That's number one. Number two, if you have to have political debates at the family dinner, start off this way. Okay, lesson one, ask well-intentioned questions. Well-intentioned questions, honest questions will help you understand their position better and maybe even lead them to your conclusion, but on their own as they answer those questions. It's important to be very clear about the topic that you're actually debating. Oftentimes in these very emotional discussions, that can be pretty unclear what you're even talking about. Politics often becomes about who is the worst person? Don't you guys have bad people? Well, you guys have bad people. You guys have worse people. You guys have the worst people. That is useless debate, okay? And you should point it out if it ever devolves into that and say, hold on, let's take a step back. Let's take a step back and argue with each other based on our best arguments, okay? So, but ask questions. I mean, for instance, if you're debating the gender wage gap, ask if they've considered whether or not men and women choose the same jobs or work as many hours as each other. Now, once you've asked those questions in a kind, thoughtful way, you'll have a much better idea where your opponent or your sister is coming from. And you can now anticipate their arguments a little bit better. You probably know by now what really sets off certain members of your family, so you might know what they're going to bring up. Make sure that you steel man those arguments ahead of time. Okay, don't straw man, right? A straw man is easy to break down. A steel man is hard to take down, because a steel man argument is what you should be fighting against. Don't talk past each other. Address the points directly, and even concede sometimes. You can concede good points they make. Right? Because oftentimes we are trying to get to the same place, and they speak in the language of compassion. We're often trying to get at the same place. We have different ways of getting there. We would argue that conservatism is, and you can use this, right? Well, what does it mean to be a conservative? Because if you're a liberal, it just means you care. You guys don't care. Well, a conservative is about problem solving within a framework of limiting principles. It's a really important point about what conservatism is. Next, frame your argument honestly and frame the discussion in a way that helps them understand the core of your beliefs. So they'll probably think that you just want tax breaks for the rich. Explain that we just have simply different principles of taxation and what the government can do. The right believes we should value hard work and success and not punish it. We know, and sometimes you have to argue with the premise of their point, and sometimes you accept their premise and move on and argue for solutions. Okay, very, very two distinct things. So in this case, you have to argue with their premise, because they say the rich don't pay their fair share. So you can say the top 1% of earners already pay 40% of all federal revenue. Is that really a fair share? Now, on the contrary to what we believe on inequality and taxation, the left believes the government knows best what to do with the money, and they want to make sure that the right people who need it get it. Okay? Again, they talk in the language of compassion. But ask them a question. If they were to donate $100 right now, would they donate to charity or give it to the government? Honest people will say charity. Look, last, just be a happy warrior. Laughing is the best way to end a political debate with your family. It's good to just throw your hands up, make a self-deprecating joke, and then buy rounds of tequila for everybody. Okay, because everybody, left and right, likes tequila. All right, so let's go into some details on some issues here. All right, let me pull up my notes because we're going to get this right now. big, and if you listen to this podcast, you know that I talk about climate change debate a lot, environmentalism. But let me kind of distill a lot of those arguments into some easy points for you to make. So the argument goes like this: there's a climate crisis, natural disasters are getting deadlier, and the United States is doing nothing about it because they're obsessed with fossil fuels. All right, but here are the facts. There has been a 92% decline in the decadal death toll from natural disasters since its peak in the 1920s. 92% decline. 1920, 5.4 million people died from natural disasters. In the 2010s, just 0.4 million people did. Now keep in mind, massive population growth during that time too. So that's why you get that huge number, 92%. It's incredible. Why is that? Because of mitigating factors, mitigating infrastructure, better mitigation. Means storms, everything is more survivable. For 40 years, the climate crisis has indeed been predicted, but humans are actually safer than ever from the climate. The climate death rate has decreased by 98% over the last century. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration predicts that the max intensity of Atlantic hurricanes and tropical storms will rise just about 5% in the 21st century, but the frequency of hurricanes will actually decrease by 25%. So this, you keep hearing the superstorms are coming, superstorms meaning maybe on average 5% more extreme. That's what our science tells us. That's the scientific consensus. IPCC, which is the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also found that by 2100, the global economy will be about 3 to 6 times larger than it is today. Okay, now that's about if you average that out, about a 450% increase in global GDP. That's increasing your wealth, and that's because of all the new technologies. Every GDP is always increasing. Okay, we're getting more and more people out of poverty in modern times. But there's going to be a cost to climate change, they say. And the cost of adapting to a 4 degrees Celsius temperature rise, which is, by the way, a very high estimate that no serious scientist believes will happen. It assumes that we will only burn coal from now until the end of the century, which of course is not happening. But even if it's 4 degrees Celsius temperature rise, which again is very unrealistic, it would reduce global gross domestic product by just 4.5%. So there's a cost to climate change, but it's actually rather small. And that's what the scientific consensus actually says. You'll hear a lot of alarmism and red alert, red alert. They're really just referring to one line in the UN climate report. And they always quote this line that basically just says, humans have caused some warming. There's clearly been some warming. It's caused some changes. That's not a red alert. It's a cost, right? But when we talk about climate change, always bring your family member back to this basic question: is the cost of your solutions greater than the cost of the actual problem? And it will be. It always is. It's also worth noting natural gas is a primary reason for emission reductions in the United States. We're back to 1992 levels almost entirely because of natural gas. And as the IPCC notes, natural gas has reduced our reliance on coal, which is an important reason for the reduction. All right, we could talk about that forever, obviously. Let's go to border crisis. So the argument goes something like this. The border crisis is nothing new. It was just a trend from the Trump administration. Every president has to deal with it. Trump's policies weren't even effective anyways. All right, let's just look at some cold hard numbers. In 2021, highest number of encounters in a fiscal year, surpassing the previous record set in the year 2000. Guess what that number is? 1.7 million. Almost 2 million crossings. Absolute record. Under Biden, the monthly numbers rapidly increased too. As soon as he took office in January, there were 78,000 encounters. The next month, there were 100,000, and then 160,000 since March. In July, they actually peaked at 213,000. And these apprehensions are exploited by cartels who coordinate large groups to tie down Border Patrol resources. Border Patrol agents just become babysitters and nannies and bus drivers. And that way, the cartels can send their drugs and their human smugglers who don't want to get caught. That's what a wall prevents, by the way, the people who don't want to get caught. Border Patrol agents are taken off the line due to large number of migrants they apprehend, and this leaves everything more open. They estimate about 1,000 getaways every single day. 1,000 people just get away from them. They don't even note them in the total numbers every single day. And obviously, if they get away, they're staying. This year, more than 95,000 migrants have been released without notices to appear, but merely notices to report to an ICE office within 60 days. The first 50,000 reported to have been given notices to report. Merely 13% reported within the 60-day time limit. So The left always says that like 90% of immigrants, they come to their court dates. The right always says, no, they don't. They don't show up. Of course they don't show up. Okay, so who's right? Well, we are. Okay, that's why I'm doing this. All right. They'll look at if they're making that claim, they're using some data that is spread across almost a decade. Okay. And it also includes all asylum seekers from every single country. Now, if you're an asylum seeker from Africa and you made it here and you're claiming asylum, you probably have a real asylum case. It stands to reason if you're one of the people just walking across our southern border, there's a less likelihood that you have an asylum case, more likely that you're an economic migrant. And as it turns out, the data shows that the people, because that's what we're interested in, right, is the people coming across the southern border who are claiming asylum and abusing our laws. There's a couple studies that dealt with this. One I just told you, the 50,000 people reported were told to report to ICE. Only 13% actually reported. So it's more like 90% don't show up. All right, that's closer. And then data from actual asylum approvals in the Northern Triangle countries hover around 10 to 15% as well. So that shows only a very, very small number of these people actually have an asylum case, and yet they're all claiming it. Another study that followed 7,000 migrant family units. This was in 2019. The study was done by DHS. They used a pilot program to track 7,000 family units and see how many showed up. And again, about 90% didn't show up. So that's a more accurate sense of the people we're talking about, the demographic we're talking about, which is those coming across the southern border. I guess you can also use this really quick. What did Biden change, right? If they're claiming that it didn't change under Trump, or this is just a trend line from Trump, you can note a few things that happened in January under Biden. He removed the Remain in Mexico policy. He removed the asylum cooperation agreements with the Northern Triangle countries. Those two things were stemming the tide. Critical race theory. Okay, the argument goes something like this. Republicans are obsessed with critical race theory, which isn't even being taught in schools. And even if it was, all CRT is teaching is just an honest history of racism in America. What, you don't want to teach about slavery? All right, well, it's not history. That's not what critical race theory is. Critical race theory is an interpretation of history that puts everything through the lens of race and only race. Here's a definition you'll often see from critical race theorists. It goes something like this. This is interesting. Critical race theory is a framework of analysis grounded in critical theory and an academic movement of civil rights scholars and activists who seek to examine the intersection of race and law in the United States and to challenge mainstream American liberal approaches to racial justice. So they were trying to challenge the liberal approach to racial justice. They'll often say that they're trying to challenge liberal notions of equality under the law, of neutral application of justice and the law. That's pretty scary stuff. I mean, that means that an outcome would be dependent not on a well-defined process, a due process, or evidentiary standards, but on your skin color. According to now let's talk about whether it's actually being taught or not. The answer is, of course, it is. Oftentimes, it's not called critical race theory, but it's under the cloak of diversity and inclusion training or something along those lines. Again, critical race theory is a set of principles, and you can apply those principles in anything that you're teaching without calling it critical race theory. According to a 2015 training program issued by the Virginia Department of Education, state public schools were encouraged to embrace critical race theory and engage in race-conscious teaching and learning as part of the program's culturally responsive teaching and learning principles. The slideshow also urged schools to adopt a critical race theory lens when surveying culturally responsive alternatives to school suspensions. So there you go. I mean, Virginia's been in the news a lot. They just won an election there. Republicans did anyway because of these kind of issues, because indeed they're real. In an elementary school in California, third graders were told to see themselves as either oppressed or oppressor. In Indianapolis, public schools advised their principals to tell parents that CRT is not taught in their schools while offering professional development for their teachers that explicitly outlines the tenets of CRT, recommends strategies for incorporating it, and suggests further reading, including Ibram X. Kendi. So see, this is what I was talking about. Now, Ibram X. Kendi, he's a prominent CRT writer, says that this is a quote, "The only way to deal with past discrimination is present discrimination and future discrimination." So this is how they see the world. And you don't have to call it CRT to know that that's bad. All right, guns. Let's talk about some guns. Now, here's a claim. Weapons of war, assault rifles have no place on the street. Well, let's see if taking rifles away from everybody would even have an effect on crime. I can argue pretty clearly that it probably wouldn't. Rifles are not really used in the commission of most crimes, and especially murders. According to the FBI's most recent publicly released data in 2019, more people were killed by knives than were killed by rifles. More people were killed by blunt objects like hammers than were killed by rifles. And more people were killed by personal weapons like hands, fists, and feet than were killed by rifles. Rifles account for less than 3% of all gun-related homicides. Keep in mind, if you made all rifles disappear right now, it is not obvious that that 3% would go down to zero. I think it's more obvious that they would just replace their murder weapon with something else, and the same amount of people would probably die. Rifles have a huge benefit, however, when it comes to women being able to protect themselves in the home. They're easier to shoot than a handgun. And if your family has ever shot one, they know this. And you can point it out this way. Look, they're easier to aim. They don't kick like a pistol does. And they have 3 points of contact. They're just easier to maneuver and use. And accuracy is everything, and comfort with the weapon is everything in a really tense situation. Untrained people, which is just about literally everybody, even all the gun nuts out there, you ain't that good at shooting, we know. It's you need the best weapon possible for that scenario. Another claim on guns, they say it's easier to buy a gun than toothpaste. Okay, well, let's go through what the facts are. To buy a gun from a dealer in the United States, you have to fill out an ATF Form 4473 that gets ran through NICS, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. You have to present an ID with current information, provide personal information, and affirm you are not a felon, not been dishonorably discharged, have a court order against you, been convicted of domestic violence, or are a drug user. Now, there's the so-called gun show loophole that they talk about, but this is largely a fallacy. A gun show's licensed dealers still require the form and NICS check. What it alluded to is what the loophole notion refers to is the person-to-person sales, which can happen at gun shows, but also among friends, family, coworkers, or at the shooting range, or anywhere. It depends on the state, but you can legally transfer guns from individual to individual. It is illegal under 18 U.S. Code 922 to transfer a gun to someone you know is ineligible to possess a firearms under U.S. law. Okay? So it's already illegal to transfer the gun to somebody who wouldn't pass a background check, and that you have to know that they wouldn't pass a background check. Which is, by the way, if there's anything illegal going on, so this is what universal background checks get at. This idea that individual to individual transfer should be illegal all the time, everywhere, all the time. The thing is that's obviously self-enforced. So a criminal who is currently buying a bunch of guns at a dealer, because they don't have a criminal background, they don't have anything on their record, but then they're selling it to gang members who can't buy it at a gun store. And this is a problem that does happen. The question is, if you had universal background checks, would they still do that, or would they stop? The answer is, of course they would still do that. Of course they would. They're getting away with it now. What they're doing now is actually illegal because they know all those gangbangers can't pass a background check. But what is to prevent them from continuing to do it? Nothing. Look, the only way you get rid of gun violence around the world is to snap your fingers and make every single one disappear. And since you can't do that, you have to be more honest and more realistic about what's possible and what makes sense, and let people protect themselves. Turns out, too, the person-to-person sales that we're talking about, they're not the driver of guns on the street used in crimes. Weapons purchased through the gun show loophole, supposed thing, account for 1% of crimes committed, whereas 56% of criminal used weapons acquired by theft or the black market. That's how this stuff happens. Local news station in my hometown of Houston surveyed murders and found 63% of the murders surveyed were committed with stolen weapons. All right, there's another gun one. America has a gun problem. Just look at the numbers. Well, the numbers don't tell the whole story because they roll in suicides, which accounted for 61% of gun deaths in 2018, according to a study from UC Davis. America has a growing mental health problem. This is seen in the rising suicide rate and looking at the history of mass shooters. The same UC Davis study found suicide as the 10th leading cause of death and the second leading cause of death for those between the ages of 10 and 34. When it comes to mass shootings, which accounted for 0.2% of gun deaths in the UC Davis study, research has shown almost every mass shooter had a history of mental illness. So aside from suicide and mental health issues, most violent crimes, especially murder, happen in geographically compact areas. Crime Prevention Research Center study found over 50% of murders happen in 2% of the nation's 3,000 counties, and the likelihood of being the victim of a gun-related homicide increases if someone is involved in gangs or drug activity. The vast majority of crime happens in very few places with the same people over and over again coming in and out of jail who are involved in gangs and drugs. That continues to be true. So disarming a bunch of Trump supporters is not going to make you safer. All right. This one may come up. Planned Parenthood and women's health care. So the claim is Republicans don't care about women's health care. They demonize Planned Parenthood, which is a leader in providing essential health care to women outside of abortions. All right, let's debunk this. Facts are, total cancer screening and prevention services have dropped by 63%, including declines of 64% for breast exams and almost 65% for Pap tests. Prenatal services are down 79% from their peak in 2009. For every adoption referral in 2018 to 2019, Planned Parenthood performed 133 abortions. Over the past 10 annual reports, the ratio is approximately 129 abortions for every adoption referral. In 2018 to 2019, abortions made up 96% of Planned Parenthood's pregnancy resolution services. There's 20 community providers for every one Planned Parenthood. Okay, that's the important thing to note here. Community providers mean rural health clinics, federally qualified health centers. All right, and these actually provide care for women in a variety of ways. So Republicans have funded, and President Trump signed into law, historic extensions of these healthcare centers when we held the majority and President Trump was in office. All right, wealth inequality. This is a good one. Wealth inequality. Republicans only care about the rich. So all your policies help the wealthy and hurt the poor. Democrat policies actually help the poor, the people. All right, here's the facts. Despite Democrat claims, in recent years, real median wages are at an all-time high. Median household income is at an all-time high, and poverty is at an all-time low. Now, these things all came about under the Trump administration. Prior to the pandemic, the poverty rate showed a steady decline. In 2019, the rate was 10%, which marked 5 straight years of declines. Contrast that to now under Democrats, real wages, factoring in inflation, are actually falling. Between 2016 and 2020, real wealth inequality for Americans declined, according to Federal Reserve data. Real wealth held by the bottom half of households grew over 3 times faster than wealth held by the top half of households. At the same time, Republicans are delivering on broad-based tax and regulatory reform to boost the economy. So let's say that part again. The fastest wage increases were happening at the bottom quintile of earners. The poorest people were seeing the highest wage increases the fastest. Now, in absolute terms, no, I understand that doesn't happen. It's impossible for that to happen. If your wages increase by 100%, but you make $100,000 a year, well, then your wages just increase to $200,000. Now, if somebody makes $500,000 a year and their wages increase by 100%, then they get $1 million. So in absolute terms, inequality will continue to increase. But the question is that really what matters? Does it matter to me that there's people who live 15 minutes away that are vastly more rich than I'll ever be? I mean, vastly. Tens of millions of dollars. No, not even close. Does that matter to me, or does it matter to me that when I work hard, I'm rewarded for that? That I have the freedom to start my own business and to maybe get to where they are someday without all these government barriers in place of that success? That's what actually matters to me. Because you can always do this little math thought experiment with your family, right? Point out 2 people who make 2 different incomes, one higher than the other. They both get 100% increase in their pay. What happens to inequality? It also doubles. So it's not what people think it is. It's also important to point out how Republicans helped all Americans during the pandemic. In the 2008 financial crisis, real wealth held by the bottom half of households fell by nearly 37% rate. And it took nearly a decade to recover under Democrat leadership under Obama. But in 2020, under Republican leadership, real net worth held by the bottom half of households rose and actually grew at more than twice the rate as the top 1%. Under the House-passed spending bill, they increased the SALT cap to $80,000. So this is the recent bill. Okay, the recent bill, the reconciliation bill that got passed last week. Under the House-passed spending bill, they increased the SALT cap, which is the state and local tax deduction cap, to $80,000, which is increasing the number of millionaires who receive a tax cut in liberal states. This may result in a tax break of around $36,000 for the top 1%. According to the left-leaning Tax Policy Center, 66% of taxpayers earning over $1 million in income get a tax cut, averaging $17,000, while 20 to 30% of middle-income households would have a tax hike in 2022. Look at that. Rich also pay their fair share. Look, after Trump's tax cuts, the tax code actually got more progressive. Bernie Sanders is always saying we need a progressive tax code. We have one of the most progressive tax codes in the world. It's hard to find if OECD, which is all the developed nations, have done more studies on this, but one in the last 10 years showed that we were number one, by far. Number one. We have the most progressive tax system, which shocks a lot of people. Since 2001, the top 1% of federal income taxes paid grew from 33% to 40%. So the top 1%, so they always say the top 1% doesn't pay their fair share. Well, they pay about 40% of all taxes. 1% of people pay, sorry, it's not even 1% of people. It's a very small number of people. It's the top 1% of earners. And so they pay 40%. The bottom half of earners pay almost nothing. They pay almost nothing as a share of total federal revenue. All right. Pay gap. Women, the argument goes something like this. There's a gender pay gap in this country. Female workers are still paid an average considerably less than male workers, and as a result, it's a pernicious wage gap crisis. Here are the facts. Most of the gap actually disappears when factors such as hours worked per week, rates of leaving the labor force, and industry and occupation are considered. So let's just put that into layman's terms. It's one thing to take the average of all earnings and see what happens. It's quite another if you look at one industry, say nursing, and look at male nurses and female nurses and see if there's a discrepancy there. And then you have to look at, this seems there's a discrepancy, but let's look at another average. How many hours are they actually working? Women tend to work less hours. They tend to value family time more than men do. So once you account for all these things, the gap starts to disappear. So here's another example. Among full-time workers, men are more likely than women to choose to work more than 40 hours per week. In 2019, 25% of men who usually work full-time worked 41 or more hours per week, compared with 14% of women. For those who worked exactly a 40-hour work week, women earned 87% as much as men. A 2020 study by the compensation software company PayScale found that when accounting for job title, years of experience, industry location, and other compensable factors, women earned 98% as much as men. So when you actually take into account everything, changes radically, to where it's almost even. A 2009 study commissioned by Department of Labor found a gender wage gap between 4.8 and 7.1% when controlling for economic variables between men and women. So if anything, the gap is disappearing. 2018 Harvard University study found that the gap in pay between female and male bus and train operators working for the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority can be explained by the workplace choices that women and men make rather than other factors such as discrimination. The study found the earnings gap for MBTA bus and train operators is explained by the fact that the male operators took 48% fewer unpaid hours off and worked 83% more overtime hours per year than the female operators. So, not exactly a wage gap. I've seen other studies, by the way, that show that for young women under 30 in all major cities, in like the top 150 major cities, there's indeed a pay gap and women make more. That was a lot. Whew, lost my voice there. Look, I hope your debate goes well. I hope you don't have a debate. But remember, if you don't like the direction of where it's going, offer everybody tequila shots like a good Thanksgiving host. All right, that's it, y'all. Happy Thanksgiving.